What if the deepest prison was never made of walls, but of words repeated so often that no one thought to question what had been left out? Maybe that is where this story begins. Not in a desert, not in a monastery, not in the courts of empire, but in the quiet space inside you that has always felt the prayer ended too soon. You may have spoken it since childhood, in churches filled with candlelight, at tables before meals, beside hospital beds, at funerals, in those private moments when fear stripped away every polished thought and only the oldest words remained. Our Father, who art in heaven. It came to you like water from a hidden spring, familiar, sacred, almost automatic. And yet, for some people, perhaps for you, there has always been a strange ache at the end of it, a silence that does not feel like peace, a pause that lands too early, as if the prayer closes a door when something inside you was still reaching for it to open. That feeling is worth listening to. Not because it proves anything, not because it settles doctrine, but because sometimes the soul recognizes a missing note long before the mind finds the courage to ask why the song feels incomplete. For nearly 2,000 years, the Lord's Prayer has moved across continents, languages, empires, and ruins. It has been carried in the mouths of emperors and peasants, monks and mothers, soldiers and children. Billions have spoken the same words. But hidden inside that repetition is a question almost no one dares to hold for very long. What if the version most people inherited was not the whole? What if somewhere between the living voice of Jesus and the forms approved for public worship, something intimate was cut away, not merely by time, but through a long process of selection and control that made spiritual memory safer and easier to govern? Because if a prayer as central as this could be edited, softened, or redirected, then the loss would not only be historical, it would be personal. It would live in the body as absence. It would echo in every amen that felt like an ending when your spirit was still waiting for a return. In 1945, in the desert sands near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a buried library of ancient Christian and Gnostic texts was discovered. It had been hidden away for over 16 centuries, long enough for empires to rise, creeds to harden, and official memory to become almost indistinguishable from unquestioned truth. Many believe these texts were concealed by monks who understood that certain writings would not survive the narrowing of acceptable belief. Within those pages were sayings, visions, teachings, and fragments attributed to Jesus and early mystics, voices that stood close to the edges of what would later be called heresy. They did not always speak in the language of institution, obedience, and distance. Often they spoke in the language of awakening, of hidden light, of the kingdom as something interior, immediate, and dangerously near. And among the scattered traces preserved in ancient teachings, oral traditions, and early spiritual communities, there appears a haunting idea that the prayer later fixed into public religion may once have carried a different completion, one not centered on a distant throne, but on a return of divine presence into the one who prays. This is where the thread becomes unsettling, because the line most Christians know, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever," does not appear in the earliest Greek manuscripts of Matthew. It was added later in the liturgical life of the Church, beautiful to the ear, majestic in rhythm, fitting for communal recitation, but not necessarily original to the earliest form of the text. That does not mean it is empty. It means something else may have stood there before, or something more intimate may have once been felt, where later generations learned to stop. In some esoteric interpretations, shaped by Aramaic echoes, desert mysticism, and the inner readings loved by Gnostic seekers, the prayer was not meant to end as a statement directed outward to a remote God. It was meant to return inward, to complete a circuit, to move from heaven to earth, and then from earth back into awakened consciousness. Not a final bow before distance, but a recognition of union. Not closure, but ignition. In that vision, the prayer becomes a map of descent, return, and remembrance. And if that is even partly true, then what was lost was not only a sentence, it was a living pattern of return. It was the final movement that prevented the soul from remaining small. It was the breath after the breath. It was the part that would have told you the presence you were invoking was not locked behind an altar, controlled by a priesthood, or delayed until death, but was already moving through you, closer than thought, nearer than your own name. From a Gnostic lens, this changes everything, because Gnosticism, at its heart, is not merely about secret books or forbidden sects. It is about the unbearable possibility that what you seek outside has always been hidden within, buried under fear, habit, authority, and the stories that taught you to distrust your own interior knowing. It whispers that the divine spark in you is not an ornament, it is origin. It suggests that salvation may be less a rescue from afar than an awakening from a long enchantment. And that is precisely why such ideas have always carried the scent of danger. A religion built around intermediaries cannot easily welcome a teaching that tells the seeker the door was never truly outside. An institution shaped by hierarchy cannot fully relax around the possibility that the kingdom is accessed in silence, breath, remembrance, and inner sight. And still, something in the human heart kept noticing the gap. Maybe that is why this question returns now, why it finds you here, why it feels less like information and more like recognition. Perhaps the issue is not simply whether a line was removed, but why the modern soul still aches as though it has inherited a prayer that stops one step before awakening. Perhaps what was hidden was never fully destroyed. Perhaps it slipped beneath doctrine and remained alive in caves, deserts, whispered teachings, and the bodies of those who prayed not just with language, but with breath. And perhaps the next step is not to argue, but to listen more carefully to the silence that comes after the words, because that is where the old mystery begins to stir again. If the prayer stopped one step before awakening, then the next question is impossible to ignore. Where did that missing movement go? And who continued to carry it after the public forum had closed around it? The strange thing about living teachings is that even when they are edited on the page, they do not vanish completely. They retreat. They pass into symbol, into memory, into the body, into the breath of those who can still feel what the official version no longer says aloud. That is why the story does not end with manuscripts and councils. It moves into deserts, into hidden communities, into the silence of those who refuse to let inward knowledge die. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, as Christianity was being gathered, standardized, and increasingly aligned with imperial order, after Constantine legalized the faith and the Roman world began to shape it into something universal, organized, and administratively stable, another current was still alive beneath the surface. In Egypt and Syria, early Christian mystics withdrew into the wilderness, not because they hated the world, but because they sensed how quickly the inner fire could be buried beneath structure. These desert seekers were not interested only in reciting sacred language. They wanted to become transparent enough to hear what the language was pointing toward. They sat in stillness. They watched the movement of thought. They prayed with the body. They breathed as though prayer itself were a bridge between visible life and an unseen homeland. In that atmosphere, the Lord's Prayer could be understood not simply as a request sent upward, but as a descent of consciousness into simplicity and a return into union. This matters deeply in a Gnostic frame, because Gnosticism has always treated words as doorways rather than endpoints. A surface reading belongs to the crowd. An inner reading belongs to the one who is ready to see. So when mystics and seekers listened to these ancient lines, they did not hear only doctrine. They heard code. They heard pattern. They heard a map of what happens when a person begins trapped in separation. and slowly remembers the light within. In this sense, the prayer begins in apparent distance. Our Father, who art in heaven. But even there, the old inner traditions heard something more intimate. In Aramaic-based mystical interpretation, Father was not only a title for a remote ruler. It could be heard as source, origin, living breath, the unseen womb of being itself. Heaven was not merely a location beyond the clouds. It was the subtle dimension, the hidden field, the luminous depth from which visible life arises. Suddenly, the opening line is no longer a glance upward toward faraway power. It becomes a turning inward toward the ground of life already nearer than your own thoughts. The prayer begins not with exile, but with forgotten closeness. That shift alone is enough to disturb inherited assumptions. Because once sacred language becomes inwardly experiential, the role of external control begins to tremble. This is where the tension between institution and inner knowledge becomes most visible. Empire needed clear forms, stable words, repeatable structures, but the inward fire did not fit easily inside walls. But a mystical current, especially one resonant with Gnostic thought, often moves in the opposite direction. It speaks to the solitary heart. It privileges awakening over compliance, direct encounter over inherited certainty, transformation over mere affiliation. It suggests that the deepest authority may not always arrive from outside, in the form of command, but from within as remembrance. This is not political rebellion, but something more intimate, and therefore harder to regulate. If the kingdom is within, if the divine spark is already present, if prayer can become recognition instead of petition, then the seeker changes from dependent observer into living participant. The structure of power does not disappear, but it loses its monopoly over access. That possibility alone would have felt too volatile in an age when unity of belief was increasingly tied to unity of empire. So the great narrowing began, not always through dramatic destruction, but through the quieter force of preference. Some writings were copied, others were neglected. Some interpretations were blessed. Others were named dangerous, confusing, misleading, or spiritually risky. The Nag Hammadi discoveries offer a glimpse of what was pushed to the edges. There we find texts like the Gospel of Thomas, which does not present salvation primarily as obedience to an external system, but as a form of unveiling. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. That line feels almost like a key left in plain sight. It does not deny the sacred. It relocates the path. It asks the listener to stop waiting only for rescue from above and begin noticing the hidden life already present within. That is a profoundly destabilizing idea for any worldview that depends on keeping the individual spiritually incomplete. And it harmonizes with the haunting possibility that the Lord's Prayer once held, or at least once conveyed, a more interior completion than what later liturgy preserved. The issue, then, is not merely textual, it is existential. What kind of human being does a prayer produce? If a prayer ends by directing all energy outward, the person may remain reverent, humble, dependent, and comforted, but also subtly separate. God remains elsewhere. The sacred remains above. The self remains below, asking, waiting, hoping. But if the prayer returns inward, if its final movement seals the recognition that divine breath is already moving through the one who prays, then something changes. The one praying is no longer simply appealing to heaven. The one praying becomes aware of heaven, hidden in the act of awareness itself. From a Gnostic perspective, that is not arrogance, it is remembrance. It does not make the person greater than God. It dissolves the fantasy that the soul was ever truly cut off from the source in the first place. You can feel why this kind of teaching would remain alive among mystics, even when official forms moved elsewhere. It meets a wound many people carry in silence, the wound of feeling spiritually orphaned, the wound of being told that the holy is real but always just beyond reach. In this reading, the missing completion of the prayer is not merely about ancient scribes or doctrinal history. It becomes a symbol for the larger human condition, a life trained to stop at the threshold, to accept fragments as fullness, to call distance devotion, and forget that the last movement of the journey was always return. That is why hidden teachings often feel so charged when encountered. They do not merely inform, they expose. They reveal where a person has been living beneath their inheritance. They stir both longing and resistance, because to hear that you have been taught an incomplete pattern is both liberating and unsettling. It means some of what you trusted may have been shaped for reasons other than your awakening. It means your loneliness may not have been proof of spiritual failure. It may have been the result of being handed a map with the final path erased, and yet the old current insists that nothing essential was ever fully lost. In mystical Christianity, in the sayings preserved outside the canon, in the contemplative practices of the desert, in the intuition that prayer is more than language, there remains the suggestion that the real transmission was carried person to person, breath to breath, silence to silence. The page could be edited. Memory could not be so easily contained. The line could disappear from official use and still survive in the shape of inner practice. That is why some ancient seekers approached prayer not as recitation, but as embodiment. The words were only the visible layer. Beneath them was rhythm, attention, surrender, inward descent, and a strange kind of remembering that did not feel like learning something new so much as returning to what had always been present. And maybe that is the deeper urgency here. Not to win an argument about manuscripts, but to recognize the moment you are living in. Because when old forms begin to feel empty, when inherited language no longer reaches the depth it once promised, when people around the world start sensing the gap between religion and transformation, something ancient begins stirring again. The sealed door no longer feels secure. The buried voice begins to sound through cracks in the stone. And the person who hears it, even faintly, may realize that the next stage of the journey is not about receiving permission from the outer world, but about recovering the courage to trust what the inner world has been whispering for a very long time. If the buried current was never fully destroyed, then the final movement of this story is not simply about what ancient communities preserved, but about what begins to happen when that hidden pattern is felt again inside an ordinary human life. Because this is where the question stops being historical and becomes immediate. It stops being about monks in the desert, councils in distant centuries, missing lines in fragile manuscripts, and starts touching the quiet place in you that has long suspected you were made for more than distance, more than repetition, more than a faith that leaves the deepest chamber unopened. From a Gnostic point of view, the true drama has never been only about what institutions allowed or forbade. The deeper drama is the forgetting of the soul. It is the strange sleep in which a person can spend years speaking sacred words and still remain cut off from the living center those words were meant to awaken. That is why the possibility of a lost completion in the Lord's Prayer matters so much. Not because a single phrase solves everything, nor because the past can be recovered with perfect certainty, but because the symbol of a missing ending mirrors the spiritual condition of so many lives. Beginning the journey sincerely, moving through all the right forms, and yet stopping just before return. In the older mystical imagination, prayer was not merely a statement of belief, it was an event. It was something that happened to the one who entered it. It descended into the body, reordered attention, softened the false self, and gently dissolved the illusion of separation. The Gnostic seeker would say that what is needed is not more noise, not more borrowed conviction, not more fear-driven obedience, but gnosis, a direct interior knowing that does not shout, does not dominate, does not need to win debates. It illuminates, it reveals, it remembers. This is why hidden spiritual knowledge has always felt both dangerous and intimate. Dangerous because it does not leave the old structures untouched. Intimate because it does not arrive as ideology, but as recognition. You read something, hear something, breathe something, and suddenly the words do not feel foreign. They feel like they were waiting for you. The original prayer, read through this lens, appears less like a petition from below to above and more like a sacred movement, from origin to embodiment and back again. It begins with source, passes through hunger, forgiveness, struggle, and bewilderment. And then it was perhaps meant to culminate in a return so direct that the one praying could no longer pretend the divine was elsewhere. That is why the reconstructed inner ending carries such force in mystical retellings. For yours is the spirit and the light, forever breathing through me. Whether one treats that line as historical memory, symbolic reconstruction, or contemplative key, its effect is the same. It changes the posture of the soul. You are no longer speaking into a distant sky, hoping someone far away will hear you. You are recognizing that the breath moving through your chest, the awareness reading these words, the stillness behind your thoughts, may itself be the meeting place you were taught to seek elsewhere. In Gnostic language, this is the awakening of the divine spark, the remembering of the light hidden in matter, the moment when the exile discovers that the map home was inscribed inside all along. And this is where the emotional force of the teaching becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because once a person even glimpses this possibility, old ideas begin to loosen. The belief that you are fundamentally cut off, the habit of approaching the sacred as though it were always withholding itself, the quiet shame that tells you you are unworthy of direct encounter, the learned helplessness that confuses dependency with humility. None of these dissolve all at once, but something begins to crack. A window opens. The self you thought you had to become in order to be worthy of God starts to fall away, and beneath it is something simpler, older, and far less frightened. Not perfection, not superiority, presence. This is why so much mystical teaching speaks in the language of remembrance rather than acquisition. You are not being handed a foreign treasure. You are being led back toward what was covered over. In that sense, the most powerful spiritual reversal is not the discovery of a new doctrine. It is the collapse of the old trance. The trance that said the kingdom is always later. The trance that said holiness belongs elsewhere. The trance that said your role is only to repeat, obey, and wait. The Gnostic current dares to suggest another possibility, that the fracture is not ultimate, that the veil is thinner than you were taught, that Christ may be encountered not only as a figure of history, but as an interior pattern of awakening, a light form arising within consciousness itself. That does not erase tradition. It deepens the symbol until it becomes personal. The kingdom of God is within you. Stop sounding like poetry and start sounding like a quiet emergency. If that is true, then your life cannot remain exactly as it was. Not necessarily outwardly, not in dramatic performance, but inwardly. The way you speak, the way you breathe, the way you suffer, the way you forgive, the way you stop searching for permission to exist in union with what has never truly left you. This is also why hidden teachings often seem to arrive with uncanny timing. They do not merely say, "Here is an interesting idea." They arrive like a threshold. They make you feel that leaving now, turning away now, dismissing the stirring now, might cost you something difficult to name, not because of threat, but because of possibility. Because once you sense that a great part of your spiritual life may have been shaped around incompletion, the choice before you becomes deeply personal. Will you keep accepting the fragment as if it were the whole, or will you let the question open you? Will you continue ending the prayer where you were told to end it inwardly, or will you listen for the movement that wants to return? This is where the story comes home. Not to a church building, not to an empire, not even only to an ancient text, but to the cathedral of your own interior life, to the place where breath enters without asking permission, to the place where longing has survived every disappointment, to the place where you have felt, perhaps for years, that something sacred was near, but never fully named. If the hidden current of gnosis means anything here, it means that the sacred is not absent because you failed. The ache may not be proof of distance. It may be remembrance trying to rise. And the prayer, once restored in spirit, if not in public consensus, becomes less a recitation than a mirror. It shows you what you have been taught to forget, and what, even now, refuses to disappear. So the return is not ultimately about correcting a manuscript, it is about correcting an inner relationship. It is about the moment the seeker realizes that the light was never fully extinguished, only covered, that the final word was never meant to close the circuit of the soul, that what seemed forbidden may have been hidden precisely because it could awaken too much, and that the most subversive thing a human being can do, quietly, deeply, without spectacle, is to remember the living source not as a distant ruler alone, but as breath, awareness, presence, and light moving here, now, through the mystery of being alive. Then the prayer no longer leaves you standing outside the door. Then the silence changes. Then what was once only spoken begins, at last, to become you. And so what has unfolded here is not really a debate to be won, but a remembrance to be felt, a quiet return to what may have always been closer than it seemed. What began as a question about a prayer, a missing ending, and a buried current of hidden knowledge has slowly become something more intimate, a way of seeing the distance, the silence, and even the longing itself in a different light. Across the deserts of Egypt, the discoveries at Nag Hammadi, the whispers of the mystics, the language of breath, light, and inward awakening, the same impression has lingered beneath it all. That perhaps the soul has always known more than it was allowed to say, and that what felt missing was not emptiness, but an unfinished return. To me, the power of this idea is not in proving every detail, but in the way it invites a more inward, more symbolic, more living encounter with prayer, with Christ, and with the possibility that the kingdom was never as far away as many were taught to believe. There is something deeply moving in that, something tender, unsettling, and strangely comforting at once. I'd really love to know how this landed with you. What do you think about this interpretation of the Lord's Prayer and its hidden Gnostic meaning? Did any part of it stay with you, challenge you, or awaken something you had felt but never named? If you want, leave a comment with the words, "The return begins within," or simply share your own thoughts and feelings below. And if this kind of quiet, deeper exploration speaks to you, please like, subscribe, and stay with us for more reflections like this. Thank you so much for watching, for your presence, and for the support you give by being here.